What is up, everybody? It is TK Paps, and I am back with my second video, and today we are going to be talking about the 5 main differences between Web 2 and Web 3. Before I get started, if you find this video helpful at all, please like and subscribe. I'm going to be producing more Web 3 content on a weekly basis, and also please give me suggestions on what you want to see. I have some ideas on future videos I want to make, something like how gas works on the Ethereum network, the history of Bitcoin and Ethereum, things like that. So please give me suggestions. I'm very happy to listen, and I would make videos based on that. So let me know in the comments. But yeah, let's get right to it. The 5 main differences between Web 2 and Web 3. So first, let's talk about Web 1 in relation to Web 2 and Web 3. And Web 1 can be defined as the dawn of the internet. This started in about the 1990s. And really what we had here was just search engines and browsers. You could, quote unquote, read on the internet. And this was about all you could do. Then in the early 2000s, the internet became programmable. And this meant that you could now, quote unquote, write. So you could read, but you could also write. And this happened with the introduction of programming languages like Java, JavaScript, etc. But now with the dawn of blockchain technology and Web3, we now see that people can own. So not only can people read, they could write, but they could also own what they write. And this is very prevalent in what's going on today, because all of your information, your data, your Instagram posts, anything that you put on the internet, you technically do not own. And now with Web3 and blockchain technology, you now have the ability to own any digital content. And this is extremely, in my opinion, revolutionary. So that's how the 3 differ just at their face value. But the first difference we're going to talk about is the differences of Web 2 and Web 3 in relation to the front end and back end. It makes sense if there are any misunderstandings of the term Web 3. And this is because much of Web 2 and Web 3's front ends look basically exactly the same. The only thing you may have difference-wise in the interface that you're using is the use of a hot wallet that connects you with various networks, but this doesn't even change the front-end interaction much at all. The biggest difference is what's going on in the back end. And typically, with Web 2 and Web 2 companies, we have the data we use is stored on centralized data centers. And we typically trust, definitely big quotes here, on the trust of these third parties, such as Facebook, to control our data and secure them on its own servers. And now the protocols of Web3 combine those with the internet and computers and distribute an immutable ledger. Now that doesn't make much sense right off the bat, but the data is no longer transmitted and stored by just one party. Rather, it's managed by peer-to-peer or P2P computers. It's secured by a majority consensus of stakeholders who receive a token as a reward for verifying these transactions. The verification and transactions of computers then gets written onto this immutable public ledger, and Web3 runs on these underlying protocols where there are these peer-to-peer computers interrelating and verifying transactions that's completely decentralized, and the data is not just stored on one computer with one central authority that has all the control. So that's how the data is kind of getting moved in the back end, which is completely different than how data is transferred and stored in the current system with like many companies and applications running on Web 2 protocols. The next main difference between Web 2 and Web 3 is the idea of state, or how one can be considered stateless and the other stateful. So in computer science, state refers to the information of identity of a user that's on the internet and using applications. And Web 2 really has no state, meaning that you don't really have an identity while you're browsing the internet using applications such as Facebook, Instagram, whatever it may be. And on Web3 applications, decentralized applications, you typically will have state. You have an identity, you can store your own data without the use of centralized institutions, and value can be transferred in this peer-to-peer network with the use of tokens. Now, it may seem like at times you have state on Web 2 applications. This is really just an illusion. Things like cookies that remember your history or your logins, passwords, etc., whatever it may resemble having state, but this is not an actual identity. And further, you may say, well, the Instagram post, or Instagram account, Facebook account, YouTube account, like, what we're using here, looks like I have an identity. I have state, this is mine. But the reality is that because all of the data and protocols are run by a centralized institution, you don't actually own your account, and it could be taken away at any moment's notice. This is kind of a big thing we've been seeing with Twitter, where, controversial figures will get banned for things they say. And it's, if it was actually yours, you could not get banned because some centralized authority would not be able to take it away. So it's kind of becoming very prevalent now with this idea of state and ownership and actually having an identity over the internet. And I imagine that this idea will become more and more profound as blockchain technology and Web3 becomes more and more mainstream, and there continues to be more application to these ideas. So coming in at number 3 of the main differences between Web 2 and Web 3 is centralization versus decentralization, which should be no surprise. There really is no conversation that exists about blockchain and Web 3 without talking about this buzzword. And although the word is often overused, decentralization is both the ideology and protocol that powers Web 3. It is the main pillar that upholds this new internet. So I may be reiterating a little bit, but Web 2 is predominantly centralized in that third parties have complete control over data and the transfer of this data. And with blockchain technology, this data now becomes decentralized in a manner where it is managed by peer-to-peer computers. So to talk a little more about these Web 2 companies in the centralization, what happened was that the programmable internet led to a further centralization of decision making. These companies who created the platforms we typically interact with, like Amazon, Facebook, etc., what happened was that we didn't necessarily pay monetarily for these services, but we paid with our data, and in doing so gave these companies immense power. They now have a lot of centralized economic control and R&D decision making that now is no longer as much in the hands of the people as it was. So depending on your perception, this could be concerning, but it's definitely the reality of how the landscape has changed pretty quickly in the last few years. So coming in at number 4 is the difference between efficiency and security of Web 2 and Web 3. Right off the bat, Web 2 can be a little more efficient and Web 3 a little more secure. And these kind of typically are a give and take, where one may be more efficient at the cost of security and one may be more secure at the cost of efficiency. So let's start with the lack of efficiency for Web3. Just a very interesting tidbit. Someone actually put a chess game on chain, and for every move, they had to pay gas. Now, you could play chess for free. You don't even have to pay really at all to have an account and play unlimited games. And this was actually costing you money just to make a move. So, and it did this because it's a complicated process to put a game on an actual blockchain. And this is kind of alluding to how it's just extremely inefficient to do more complex things, on the internet and on chain. Now, for every move, you did receive an NFT, and you could then sell that NFT on like third-party marketplaces like OpenSea. But one, I don't think you would get your money back for the transaction by selling the NFTs on a third market, and it's just way more time consuming to play in that manner. But I can link the article, which is pretty interesting to see. So even though they're more inefficient currently, these protocols, that doesn't necessarily dictate the ultimate destiny. There are decentralized storage networks that are emerging, such as Filecoin, which many may be familiar with, and IPFS, which is the Interplanetary File System. And many of these decentralized storage networks are incentivized similarly to typical blockchains, where contributions are rewarded with a native token. And the storing of this data is often more secure because it coincides with that same idea of what we were talking about before, about how these transactions are secured and verified by peer-to-peer computers, and not all the control is just in the hands of third party. So we have these new storage systems coming about in the Web3 environment, but we haven't really touched on the security aspect of Web2 versus Web3, and it's arguably more important about the data being secure, especially the environment that we're in now. We have companies selling our data, data being used for whatever means the holder wants them to be without permission, and as time goes on, this problem may get even worse. And this is definitely a very relevant topic to consider, is the security of one's own data. And now there's some complicated things about how you can change a blockchain with these consensus protocols, and many have different protocols. I'm sure people have heard about the merge on Ethereum, which I believe is changing the consensus protocol to a certain extent. Bitcoin is a proof of work consensus protocol. I believe Solana is proof of stake, which is what Ethereum is trying to move more towards. And it changes the system of security, I guess you could say, but does not necessarily make it less secure, although proof of work may be considered the most secure way of verifying transactions. And proof of work may be considered the most secure because it requires immense amount of energy. Now, this doesn't seem like much at face value, but in order to change the protocol, you need a greater than 50% consensus. And all of these nodes running around the world that are verifying transactions on the Bitcoin network are using immense amount of energy to basically solve puzzles to verify transactions. These puzzles are complex algorithms. It gets a little complicated, but in order to change the network, or the blockchain, I should say, you need 51% of all computers and obviously people operating those computers to collude and go back and change the chain. Now, getting to that point, would be pretty difficult just in itself, because these peer-to-peer computers are located all around the world, and many of them have their own individual incentives and don't have a reason to collude. But let's say they did. You would then need to expend an immense amount of energy to go back each block that's connected to the last and go change the block in the past that you're colluding that you want to change. Now, meanwhile, you could do this especially if there's a lot of money on the table, I guess you could say. But we're talking about 51% of the people, the miners, colluding. There's still 49% of the others that are still using the protocol as it was intended and verifying blocks of data and continuing to make the chain longer. These people will have to then expend even more energy because more blocks are being added as they are trying to go back into the past and change a past block. So it's not just a linear amount of energy they would use. It's very dynamic, as it would be more and more as the other miners are still using the protocol as it was intended. So it's very hard with proof of work. I mean, long story short, it takes a lot of energy, and energy is obviously money. And not only that, is people are very disincentivized to break the protocol because there's far more benefit to upholding the values. This kind of relates to game theory than there is to act against it. And I think that's part of the reason why the system is set up so intelligently, that it just works with human nature, where the individual is going to look out for itself first and foremost in almost any circumstance. And this system does kind of take that into account, where the system is designed around that the person is most incentivized to work in one's own favor. And I think that's pretty profound. So the last thing, number 5, the difference between Web 2 and Web 3 is how Web 2 is the norm and Web 3 is becoming a revolution. We don't really know how Web 3 is going to change the future, but it definitely has the potential. It's still very young and volatile, and there is limited capability to predict where it's going to go. It is, however, exciting to contemplate the possibilities. Consider it a social media platform where the producer of the content owned it as well. I kind of talked about this before, where the extinction of the platform didn't result in the deletion of the user's online identity. A platform that was truly for the people. Or even a platform that rewarded stakeholders for the number of views content received in the form of a token running on a proof of view consensus protocol. Or a game where the economy was not solely tied to the game developer, and you could trade in-game items on a secondary market. And these digital in-game items, almost like Fortnite, now has outside monetary value. No matter what form change takes, there will always be innovators, early adopters, mass adopters, lagging adopters, and people that will never change. And typically the distribution of these people fall on a bell curve, where the innovators and the people that never change are the scarcest. So some may stick with the norm forever. Some will be late to the party. Many will adapt gradually with the masses. Some will energetically follow the innovators in this peaceful revolution, but few will lead, building a new and better ecosystem for the people, driving change, and making the norm obsolete. I really think it's cool and exciting to see how this will unfold over the next few years. I think it's important to understand how the new ecosystem of Web3 it can change what we are currently using in the Web2 sense, and how disruptive this technology may be. I appreciate the time and for listening, and I hope to see you for the next video. Please again, leave any suggestions or comments, down below. And yeah, I'm excited for the next video. I'll also link all of the other things I talked about in my first video, social links. You could also see transcription of this post in writing format on my blog and my website, which will again be linked. And you can listen to this basically on Medium, and I will have a short Twitter thread summarizing everything I talked about as well. So keep an eye out for those. Once again, I appreciate the viewership, and I hope everyone has a great day. And until next time, thank you so much.